Thank you so much. Wonderful introduction. I'm delighted to be with you this morning on a Sunday morning and to tell you about this exhibition that is really our first major international loans exhibition at the Wallace Collection. We have loans from North America, from across Europe, and this country. And it's really the first, because the Wallace Collection is now able to lend works, it's also able to borrow works of art. And we thought, what better way to celebrate this new status, but to organize an exhibition around our most famous painting, the Laughing Cavalier, and to bring him together with with several different friends, as we're calling them, among them being Pieter van den Broecke from Kenwood House. We're extremely delighted to have been able to borrow this amazing portrait. So what I thought I'd do this morning is take you through our thinking behind the exhibition, take you through the different works in the exhibition itself, and then leave time for questions at the end, about 10 minutes. But do pop your questions into the chat as we go along, as they occur to you, but we will be dealing with them at the end. So the exhibition has already opened. It opened in September, on the 22nd of September, and will run through the end of January. So there's plenty of time to go and visit, and please do go and see it in the flesh, because there's nothing like seeing the actual paintings, even though the photography I'm about to show you is really extraordinary. But just a little bit about what we're trying to achieve with this exhibition. As you know, Frans Hals, together with Rembrandt and Vermeer, was one of the greatest Dutch masters of the Golden Age. However, unlike Rembrandt and Vermeer, he really hasn't had as much attention. The last Frans Hals exhibition in this country was nearly over 30 years ago in 1990 at the Royal Academy, and since there has not been a single exhibition on Frans Hals. And as you know, there's 10 exhibitions on Rembrandt a year at the very least. So on the one hand is to put Frans Hals on the map as a great Dutch master. Secondly is to showcase our Laughing Cavalier, who has not been seen alongside other works by Frans Hals, at least since it was acquired by the fourth Marquis of Hertford, one of the major founders of the Wallace Collection in 1865. So since then, it's only been seen within the context of our own collection, bar an exhibition which it was lent to during Richard Wallace's time, but there it was not seen alongside Frans Hals paintings at the Royal Academy in 1888. So it's really a chance to contextualize the Laughing Cavalier for the very first time within the artist's larger oeuvre. And thirdly, the exhibition brings together a very selective group of 13 portraits of men. So we wanted to be very selective and focused, and so reunite the Laughing Cavalier with works like him. So essentially portraits of men that are half length or 3/4 length. And we have 13 of them, including our Laughing Cavalier, the best male portraits from across Frans Hals' career, which spans from the beginning of his career in 1610 until the end of his life in 1666. And we have portraits from all across that long working life of 56 years or so. And so what the exhibition does, it explores how through pose, how through fashion, how through painting technique, Frans Hals transforms the male portrait into something entirely new and fresh, capturing and revealing his sitter's characters like no one else before him. And each and every single individual portrait tells a different story, a different side of the story. And as we'll see with Pieter van den Broecke, we know more about him as an individual, so we can talk about individuals at the time and their role in society. Other portraits we know very little about. We don't even know who the sitter is. And there we can talk about costume, we can talk about Frans Hals' technique, etc. But each portrait, so there's not very many, there's only 13, but each one of them tells its own story, and I think quite captivating story at that. So just to situate you within the city of Haarlem, where Frans Hals lived and worked, his portraiture is intimately linked with the port city And this is a print of Haarlem from around the time that our Laughing Cavalier was painted. This print is from 1628. It's a view of Haarlem from the south. And at the time of when Frans Hals came onto the artistic scene in 1610, Haarlem was, a vibrant port city, but also an artistic center, particularly when it came to prints. It was a great printmaking center, surpassing Antwerp at that time. And Frans Hals's patrons are predominantly from Haarlem's elite. They are members of the militia, they're burgomasters, many of them are wealthy merchants and tradesmen. And several of them, as you'll see, are brewers and textile merchants, and beer and cloth were Haarlem's main areas of commercial production at that time. Haarlem also saw an exodus of Flemish immigrants in the late 16th century, among whom were Frans Hals's own parents, who moved from Antwerp to Haarlem when Frans Hals was only 3 years old. And a lot of Frans Hals's patrons are Flemish emigres as well. So I'll just tell you a little bit about Frans Hals. This is a copy after what is thought to be a self-portrait, which no longer exists, but this is what we think he probably looked like. He worked mainly as a portraitist. He also painted some genre scenes in the 1620s and the 1630s, but really his specialism was portraiture, not just male portraiture, of course. He painted portraits of women, painted family portraits, group portraits, militia portraits. We, of course, wanted to just be very focused to relate the paintings in the exhibition to our own picture. Despite having a very long and successful career, Frans Hals fell into obscurity after his death in 1666. He was accused of dissolute living, and also he was criticized for his lack of finish. So this very vibrant technique that we'll be talking about was actually later on considered to be unfinished by people like Reynolds and many others. He was married twice and had 12 children, and he had financial troubles throughout his life. He lived in rented accommodation across the city of Haarlem and owed money here and there. He was sued by his butcher, he was sued by his baker, the shoemaker also sued him for unpaid debts, which is probably why he was accused of being a dissolute character after he died. I mean, essentially, he probably had a hard time supporting this large family of 12 children. And, although portraits were lucrative, they weren't the most lucrative genre of painting at that time. His reputation was subsequently revived in the second half of the 19th century in Paris. He was particularly admired by Impressionists and Post-Impressionists, who really considered him their precursor in terms of the way that he painted, this bravura technique. They really admired his painting style. And actually, our own picture, the Laughing Cavalier, I'll get to it, and when we get to him, played a major role in Hals's revival in the middle of the 19th century. So I just wanted to give you, this is the introductory room to the exhibition, where we have the earliest portrait in the exhibition from 1610. This is a portrait of a man holding a skull from the Barber Institute of Fine Arts. And then we have this print that I just showed you blown up to really situate the visitor within the city of Haarlem. And then this is an opening through the main doorway, and where you get to the main room of the show, and you can see that Frans Hals that our Laughing Cavalier is at the very head of the table on one end of the room, and we've decided to leave the room open so that all of the portraits are sort of sitting as if they're sitting around a dining table, if you will. We've got the Laughing Cavalier on one end, and then we've got the latest picture, which is from the Fitzwilliam on the other end, which is a portrait that was painted in the 1660s. And you can see Pieter van den Broecke is just here. And actually, I heard from Louise Cooling, the curator at Kenwood House, of course. She was very pleased with how he was hung, because actually, how he normally hangs between those windows and the draperies, and he has a picture light. I mean, of course, we can see him very well at Kenwood, but here he's got very little around him, and hopefully he's really, you know, as a nice centerpiece of an entire wall, and we can really admire him up close. Right, so this is now the other end, looking at the room from the other end. You see, we've decided to just keep it open without sort of interruption of any extraneous walls or anything like that. And I just wanted to draw your attention, we've spent a great deal of time on the multimedia guide. So, and we're trying, and we've had really great feedback about the multimedia guide, because for each picture, we've invited different experts to give their take on that particular portrait from a variety of different perspectives to really bring them to life. So for example, for our Laughing Cavalier, so for each picture, I give kind of what you'd expect as your tour. The exhibition curator takes you through that particular portrait. And then we have experts in a variety of fields. So for example, for the Laughing Cavalier, we have our curator of arms and armor, Toby Capwell, talks about the rapier that the Laughing Cavalier carries. Nicole Ryder's a paintings conservator. She talks about the technique. We've done technical analysis on our portrait in preparation for the exhibition. So she takes us through how the portrait was painted. And then our director, Xavier Bray, interviewed contemporary artist Grayson Perry, who has, of course, thinks a lot and works a lot and thinks about masculinity. And Grayson Perry gives his take on each and every single portrait. For Pieter van den Broecke, for example, we've also got curator of history at the Rijksmuseum, Maria Holtrop, tells us about his involvement in the early years of the Dutch slave trade. We have an economic historian from the University of Utrecht, Oscar Helderbrom, who tells us about the Dutch East India Company. Of course, Pieter van den Broecke was a member of the Dutch East India Company. And then, of course, we have Grayson Perry as well. So what I'm trying to, and you can decide what you want to listen to, whether you want to listen to all of it or bits and pieces. What we're trying to do is give visitors choice in terms of the extent to which they want to, you know, to use the guide. It's very flexible in that way, but I do recommend it if you go. It is free with your entry ticket, so I do recommend taking up the guide. I think it's a really rich offer, and will, I think, bring the portraits to life for you when you visit. And then, of course, the exhibition is accompanied by a scholarly catalogue that I've been fortunate to have contributions from Dr. Ashok Roy, former head of science and head of collections at the National Gallery. And he's one of our trustees at the Wallace Collection. And he has contributed an essay on Frans Hals' technique. There's essays on our Laughing Cavalier, of course, and on the male portrait, sort of progression of the male portrait, if you will, more generally. So that is something to consider if you want to know more. So now what I thought I would do is take you through the different portraits in the exhibition and tell you a little bit about these various characters and what I find particularly fascinating about them. So as I said, this portrait from the Barber Institute of Fine Arts is the earliest portrait in the exhibition. It was painted around 1610. And as you saw, it is hung in the first room of the show, where he's sort of hanging on his own, and the rest of the portraits hang in the main space of the exhibition. And so why has he been relegated to the room, the first room, I suppose, on his own? And I suppose it not because he's any less wonderful, because it's a really technically stunning portrait. It's painted on wood. It's the only picture in the exhibition painted on panel. But I suppose it's to say that Frans Hals had relatively conventional beginnings as a portraitist. This portrait has in it what you might expect to find of a portrait of this date. And then very quickly, Frans Hals changes, evolves, and imbues his portraits with a variety of other different characteristics that really bring the sitters to life, as we'll see in the portraits that come. So for example, in this case, he's posed relatively in a stiff pose. He's rather static. He's wearing sober costume inspired by Spanish fashions, these tight-fitting garments, black clothing, without the sort of slashes that we're going to see that will appear very, very soon. The stiffly starched collar and the ruff, and of course the cuffs, and these two will evolve very quickly. So he's wearing conservative clothes. He has this attribute of the skull, which of course is about his mortality. We know from the inscription on the upper right that is very difficult to see that he is 60 years old, which at that time, not today of course, but at that time would have been a ripe old age. So it's not surprising that he holds this attribute of the skull, which is in a way almost like a second portrait of that same person. And it's also posed similarly to his own head. You see it's looking out at us rather eerily, facing us straight on. And Frans Hals will get rid of these sorts of attributes after this point. He doesn't use them in formal portraits anymore. He doesn't need these sort of extraneous signs and symbols, and then will focus solely on the sitters after this point. He has this shield and the sort of family crest, if you will, with a horse on it. Perhaps his name was something paard, which is the word for horse in Dutch, but we actually don't know who he was, his exact identity. We do know that he was conceived with a portrait of his wife. She is today at Chatsworth House, and you can see that as portrait of a woman, because we of course don't know her identity either. You can see that Frans Hals is beginning to think about how to engage these types of pendant portraits, as we call them, companion portraits, where they're conceived together, but they're on separate supports, so that the man is turned slightly towards the right to face his wife, but he's still looking out at us, and his hand is, facing in her direction, and she's also coming in a little bit towards him in her body language. But as time progresses, he begins to engage his sitters even more and more, to the extent that in a later pair, they're almost touching hands across the two canvases. And just to say that some of the men in our exhibition, some of the individuals were conceived as pendant pairs with portraits of women, and that these portraits are illustrated in our catalogue and in the multimedia guide. But due to space constraints, we did not borrow their pendant portraits. And also we just wanted to focus on the male portraits. And the last thing I will say is that convention in the Dutch Republic at this time was to have the male portrait on the left and the portrait of the wife on the right. The woman was meant to be posed on the man's sinister or lesser side, and the man was on the dexter side, the right-hand side, the dominant side, if you will. And this will become relevant when we think about the Laughing Cavalier and whether he was conceived as an independent portrait or whether he may have had a pendant. But generally, man was on the left and the woman was on the right. So then the next portrait chronologically, and the portraits are hung roughly chronologically from one end of the room to the other, is the Laughing Cavalier, painted in 1624, which is a relatively early work, if you will, in Frans Hals's oeuvre, if we think that he painted until 1666. So this portrait represents a young man of 26, which we know from the inscription at the top right. And we also have the date, 1624. And actually a lot of the portraits have exactly that, an inscription of the age and the year in which the portrait was painted, but not the name of the sitter. And I've been thinking about this, why would you have that? I've had people ask coming to see the exhibition, and then someone said to me, actually, thinking about photographs that you might have, on the back, you'll write the date. Nowadays, we don't even have physical photographs anymore, but when we did, on the back of it, you'd write the date, or of children, you might write their age, but you're not going to write their name because, of course, you know who they are. And equally is the same with these portraits. It's just that, of course, 400 years later, we've lost their identity. But at that time, of course, their identity would have been very well known to the viewers of that time. This, of course, is a very iconic painting. It's been hailed as the Dutch Mona Lisa. It never really fails to impress us, no matter how many times we look at it. But what I've tried to do in preparation for this exhibition, and there are 3 essays devoted to the Laughing Cavalier in the catalogue. It's really going to be the go-to place if you want to know more about the Laughing Cavalier, is really think about, what makes this portrait so iconic? What makes it a masterpiece? What about it is so wonderful? And of course, it's a combination of things. And what I've tried to do is take the various pieces apart and examine them and try to understand them better. What makes him quite so special, besides this amazing sort of look that he engages us with. He looks at us directly, and he actually does have the Mona Lisa effect, where he does follow your gaze when you walk rightward and leftward. He does manage to keep looking at you throughout. And of course, is it the mystery also around his lost identity? We still don't know who he was exactly. Most importantly, was he married or not? What was his profession? All of these questions, in a way, probably add to the mystery around this wonderful portrait. And of course, the engaging pose. He has his left arm akimbo, bent on the left hip, and he is positioned in the very extreme foreground of the composition, and we are looking at him from below. He sort of appears to tower over us, and this adds to the way in which Frans Hals engages us with him, and he does feel very lifelike when we stand before him. He's wearing this fantastic broad-brimmed black hat, and he's groomed to perfection. He, as you can see, we start to see the evolution of men's fashion, not just fashion, but the way they groom themselves. The sort of clean-shaven look was newly in the 1620s, and men begin to grow their hair more and more. And we can see that with the Laughing Cavalier, where we have these curls that spill out of his hat. Into the middle of the 17th century, we will see that men's hair gets longer and longer, to the point where there's actually a dispute about men letting their hair grow too long. And I'll get to that when we talk about a few other portraits later on. He is wearing the latest French fashions, and we've done some research about what he's actually wearing the most. And it is a huge departure from the Barber portrait that we just saw, of that man wearing just sober black Spanish influenced clothes. Here he's wearing this doublet with panes on the sleeves and on the front, these slashes, which were newly introduced from Paris, which allow a glimpse of the beautiful white shirt underneath, and this idea of, what you see and what you don't see, and this kind of playful this play of that clothing now begins to have as part of its sort of, I suppose, look, if you will. It's this kind of intentional slashing, professed a kind of nonchalance, a kind of sprezzatura, which is this idea of the perfect gentleman, is coined by Baltasar Castiglione in the previous century. This idea of effortlessness, but of course, such a look was, of course, very, very much conceived, and there's nothing, effortless about it. There's actually quite a bit of effort in putting together this portrait. So I just wanted to show you comparable. In fact, the doublet is very, very detailed in its embroidery. This level of embroidery is actually very unusual, and the other portraits don't have this extent of embroidery on the jackets, to the extent that a costume historian that I was in contact with said that maybe this doublet didn't even exist, because there's no extant examples of such a thing to this extent, where all of the little signs and symbols have meaning. And I'll take you through some of those in just a moment. And certainly it was a condition of the commission that this sitter wanted to be portrayed wearing this doublet. and whether the extent of his involvement with these various signs and symbols has yet to be determined. But I did find a contemporary comparable doublet, if you will, which has this vegetal sort of embroidery on it, this beautiful, very rare surviving example of a doublet, also from France, from the 1620s, with the slashes on the sleeves and on the front, and these beautiful small buttons on the sleeves and front that also continue on the back. And this is probably the way that our own doublet would have looked, the one that the Laughing Cavalier is wearing. And then, of course, he's wearing this flat falling collar, which was a departure from the stiffly starched ruffs, which were still being worn at the time. This was also at the height of fashion at this time. And it involved, of course, and you can see very different from the barber man that we looked at. And here again is a contemporary example of such a ruff that would have involved multiple layers of linen that were trimmed with bobbin lace. I mean, again, a very sumptuous item that would have been very costly and also at the height of fashion at the time. Also would have been very difficult to keep clean, I imagine, at the time as well. And then the most beautiful lace cuff. And I found a surviving example, and you can see that Frans Hals has translated the intricacy of the geometric design to paint. He's painted it on top of finished costume, and you can see bits of the costume peeping through the lace. But I mean, he shows you just in this detail, you can see the range of his facture, his ability to paint in a wide variety of ways, from very quick strokes in this upturned cuff here to very intricate, detailed, minute sort of handling of the paintbrush in the lace below. So I think this is a really wonderful, beautiful passage, and it's center stage in the foreground. He's clearly very proud of this wonderful rendition of the cuff. And then I just wanted to take you through a little bit through the iconography, which is quite complex. It's the most complex of any portrait by Frans Hals. And in fact, in Dutch portraiture more generally from this period, this kind of level of complex iconography on a garment is unheard of. And so all of the various signs and symbols on the doublet are taken from emblem literature, contemporary emblem literature, that would have been accessible to young elite gentlemen, such as the man portrayed here. And he's particularly looking at love emblem books, because a lot of the little signs and symbols have to do with love, and those would have been quite common with young people at the time. And so to us, it seems like hieroglyphics, and we don't, a lot of these, we don't know what they mean, but at the time it would have been for the elite, for the learned elite, this would have been a legible visual language. And all of the signs and symbols on his doublet have to do with fortune, strength, love, and virtue. And these are, of course, things that he probably wants to be associated with and, meant to be taken in as a whole. So the idea of fortune is suggested through Mercury's cap and staff here, prominently on one of the slashes on the doublet. Also this obelisk, for a long time, it was mysterious what it meant. It probably comes from an emblem with an obelisk in it that has to do with strength. Then there's all of these little signs and symbols that have taken from love emblem books, insects. The sting from Cupid's arrow might have to do with bees, the sting of love, winged arrows, tongues of fire, flaming cornucopia. The idea of Cupid's arrows piercing the heart and igniting the fire of love, and with it, the loss of reason. These lovers' knots in figures of 8 or quatrefoil, and this very beautiful, I think, detail of intertwined wings with 2 perpendicular arrows, again, Cupid's attributes, but in the most beautiful painted detail by Frans Hals. So that's the iconography quite complex, quite unusual, and quite remarkable for the period. And in addition to that, the sitter is carrying the most sumptuous rapier that can actually be easily missed in the crook of his left elbow. We see the pommel here, and we see bits of the hilt underneath his arm here. And it's a gilded rapier, which would have been rare, extremely costly, and again, used in the portrait as a status symbol. It really reinforces his status and wealth. And I've had a great deal of help from our Arms and Armour curator, Toby Capwell, who really dissected it, if you will, took it apart and was able to tell us all of the different parts of it. And you can see, obviously, this is the pommel, the tang button, the rear hilt, the ring guard, smaller ring guard, loop guards, all of this we didn't quite understand before this point. So I'm very fortunate to have been able to, provide this kind of explanation about what we're looking at in our catalogue. And this is to go along with the exhibition. What we very fortunately, we have a rapier in our own collection. Of course, at the Wallace, we have a very wonderful collection of arms and armor. And within our collection, we have a rapier that is very similar to the one that the Laughing Cavalier is wearing. It's gilded, it has a similar pommel and hilt. And what we've done, and this is something that you probably have not seen before and likely probably won't see again, is we've framed this rapier in a picture frame. And this picture frame hangs, this framed rapier hangs in the place where the Laughing Cavalier normally hangs in our great gallery while he is downstairs in our exhibition space, hopefully drawing visitors to come down to the exhibition, and also drawing attention to this wonderful rapier that he carries. And incidentally, the frame that we used to frame the rapier in is the Laughing Cavalier's old frame, which we also happen to have kept. We have a collection of frames at the Wallace, and this is the frame in which the Laughing Cavalier was probably acquired in 1865 when he was bought by the 4th Marquess of Hertford in Paris, and the picture was kept in this frame until the 1980s when it was reframed in its current frame. So there's a nice connection to the Laughing Cavalier in terms of the frame as well. So if you come to the exhibition, I invite you to please also visit our great gallery and see this display in situ, which I think is quite I think has a lot of powerful in its visual sort of potency. Right, I can go on, as you can see, about our Laughing Cavalier quite a bit, but I will have to move on. Just to say that we have gotten closer to identifying him, just in the sense that, obviously we know he was very wealthy. He was at the height of fashion. He was probably Flemish, because a lot of the young Flemish emigres tended to be, there's accounts that they were wearing this kind of clothing. He's also posed facing leftward, so very much the opposite of the man from the barber that we saw, who was facing his wife. So that makes me think definitely that he was a bachelor at this point, and that the portrait was conceived as an independent work, and it was not conceived together with a pendant of a wife or a female companion, if you will, on the left, because she wouldn't have been on the left, she would have been on the right, and he would have had his back to her, which would have been very unusual. So very likely that he was a bachelor, and probably of Flemish origins, as I say. And also his clothing, if he was once you married at that time, you most likely would have been wearing black, and we will see that in the portraits that we'll see in just a moment. I just wanted to tell you a little bit about the title, The Laughing Cavalier. It was coined around 1888, so much, much later in the painting's history, when the portrait was lent to the Royal Academy in 1888 by Richard Wallace. So, but it clearly stuck and has not been changed ever since. But before that, he appears in inventories as a military man, a captain, a commander, but the idea of Laughing Cavalier as a phrase was only employed for the first time in 1888. And I just wanted to tell you a little, when it was sold in 1865 at this very famous sale in Paris, the sale of the Portal-Gorgier collection, it was the fourth Marquis of Hertford bought it 6 times the estimate of the picture. He paid 6 times the estimate. It was estimated 8,000 francs, and he paid 51,000 francs for it. So more than 6 times the estimate. And he really broke all records, Frans Hals records at that time. And he really put Frans Hals back on the map as a major Dutch artist. And there's a great deal of press around the sale of the painting, around the fourth Marquis's acquisition. He was called the Mad Marquis for spending so much money on the portrait, but he was also credited for bringing Frans Hals back into fashion. And there's actually an entire essay in the catalogue about this episode, this very important episode in the painting's history and its role in reviving Frans Hals in the latter half of the 19th century. Right, and this just to show that, you know, the Laughing Cavalier has been reproduced countless times in a variety of ways. He was, on puzzles, he was on biscuits, he was on pub signs, but most recently, during the first lockdown in May of 2020, I found him as a mural in Lewisham in London, and actually a street artist painted him when the museums were shut because he wanted to make sure that great art was still accessible to the wider public. So I thought that was a really wonderful story. Of all the portraits that he could have picked, he picked this one. And of course, it's an ephemeral art, so he's not there anymore because the wall has been used to paint something else on top of it. But just to go, and it makes it also very pertinent for, you know, this pandemic that we've just gone through, and how the painting was present with us throughout. And who knows, I'm very curious to see what happens to it in its future. So in the time that we have left, which isn't very much, I'll just tell you a little bit about the other portraits in the exhibition. This is Isaac Massa. He was a merchant of Flemish origins, also a friend of Frans Hals's. And he is depicted here in a portrait that is close in date to the Laughing Cavalier, 1626. And what's really, 2 things are really remarkable about this portrait. It's his pose, first of all, which he has his arm leaning on the back of a chair. This is something that we don't see in individual portraits of men of this time. It's the first time that Frans Hals himself employs it in an independent portrait, but he likes it so much that he continues to use it, and we will see that he does recycle it time and time again. It really, again, brings his sitter to life, makes him feel quite casual, makes us feel like he's been captured in a fleeting moment. He's also looking outside the picture, which is unusual. Normally in a portrait, you'd expect the sitter to be looking out towards us. So all of these things make it feel very spontaneous. And he also has this amazing opening in the background to a verdant forest behind him, which is something, again, unusual, that normally in that space you'd find a shadow or a framed portrait. But Isaac Massa was a great traveler. He spent a great deal of time in Russia. He was a cartographer. In his own right, he wrote the first account of Siberia, European account of Siberia. And so maybe this opening into this landscape has to do with his travels. And it's possible that the landscape was painted by a different artist, which would be the only instance where we know Frans Hals collaborating with another artist on a portrait. I'll just show you here. Frans Hals had painted him previously in a portrait with his new wife, Beatrix von der Leyen, and a very, very unusual to have a double portrait of man and wife in the same painting. We saw normally they'd be pendants separated by, frames, and probably because they were friends, Massa and Frans Hals, they collaborated on paintings together, and Frans Hals was able to take artistic license in his representations of Massa. And I just wanted to show you, he probably took this device of the arm over the back of the chair from group portraits with sitters sitting in the front of a table. You see they're turning to be able to be seen. And that's probably where he was looking for this pose. But Frans Hals is the first to extrapolate it from a group portrait and put it in an individual portrait. And he uses it, you see here, in his own group portrait, and then uses it on Isaac Massa. And I just wanted to show you here that he is probably borrowing also tactics that he's using in his genre pictures. This is a jester playing the lute, Frans Hals' own picture from around the same time. And you can see how the man is sort of looking outside the picture. This is something he's using in his genre paintings that he's then bringing to his formal portraits. Pieter van den Broecke, he really has become among my favorites. I mean, we know the most about him of all the men in the exhibition. He was, of course, an admiral in the Dutch East India Company. He served them after 17 years of service. He receives this wonderful gold chain, which was worth 1,200 guilders at the time, which would have been, 4 times the yearly wages of a skilled craftsman. And of course, he's showing that off. He's wearing this, he has his hand on this baton, relatively informal pose. Hair is sort of, slightly, unkept. And somebody, one of the reviewers said that it feels as if he's on a ship sailing back, because normally if you think about a formal portrait, you may have had your hair, a bit more tidy. And he has these wonderful rosy cheeks and this smile in a way, which again is something that I think Frans Hals is borrowing from his genre pictures and bringing back into his formal portraits. Van den Broecke was also a friend of Frans Hals's, and he was witness to at the baptism of one of Hals's children. So again, I think when Frans Hals knows his sitter personally, he makes you feel like you are in the companion of a friend, which is certainly the case in this portrait. So as I say, he traveled widely to Africa and Asia, and he is actually credited for bringing coffee to Europe, being the first man to bring coffee to Europe, as you probably know the story. From Yemen, he brought coffee plants back to Amsterdam, and they figured out, actually, we can't grow coffee in Amsterdam. And then they shipped these coffee plants to Indonesia. And then the Dutch were, of course, then importing coffee from Indonesia. And by the 18th century, Amsterdam was the coffee capital of Europe, probably thanks to Pieter van den Broecke. The other thing that I've learned in doing research on him in preparation for the exhibition, in contact with this, the curator from the Rijksmuseum, who was one of the curators of the slavery exhibition, Maria Holtrop. She's done a great deal of work on him in Dutch archives, and it does turn out that he was involved in the early years of the Dutch slave trade, that he had 3 children, 2 of whom were by enslaved Indian women that he subsequently freed, and his 3rd child was by a free Turkish woman. He also, earlier on, in around 1610, he traveled to Cape Verde off the western coast of Africa, and he writes in his journal there that he buys a little girl of 10 years old for 61 kilos of rice. And actually a lot of parents offer him their children for food or money. And he writes that he's surprised at the little emotion that the mother has when she hands over this little girl of 10 years old to him, and he passes her over this rice in exchange. So I think it's an important story to tell, because I think he's not the only one that would have been involved in the slave trade. We just happen to know more about him because he left us, there's written evidence that we have. And actually the Dutch were, there was a whole debate early on whether they should be involved in the slave trade or not. So this is very much in the early phases of the slave trade. And of course it takes on later in the 17th century and into the 18th century. But we are incredibly fortunate to have him as part of the exhibition and to be able to tell these very important stories about what was happening at the time, thanks to this portrait. All right, I will take you through a little bit faster now. This is a portrait from the Rijksmuseum. You can see he's recycling this pose with the arm over the back of the chair, and he is very sketchily painted, very impressionistic, almost as if he's sort of fleeting before us. And you can see he does have a pendant wife, and the wife, also at the Rijksmuseum, is much more formally posed, and she is more tightly painted, so that we do have a sense that Frans Hals is adapting his technique to the conventions of the time. And it does seem that with his male sitters, he's able to take a few more liberties in terms of his technique and in terms of the types of poses that he's able to employ. He is a wonderful portrait. He's a brewer. His name was Van Voorhout, and his family owned a brewery in Haarlem called the Swan's Neck. And we can see that he probably sampled his product. He is wearing a most sumptuous satin doublet in a very similar pose to our Laughing Cavalier, and he's hung close to the Laughing Cavalier, so we can have this wonderful visual dialogue between the two pictures. But although quite sumptuous, like our doublet in the Laughing Cavalier, very different. Obviously, it doesn't have the level of embroidery, but the most striking bravura paint technique, where you really feel Frans Hals laying down the strokes of paint on this canvas with these unblended brush strokes. And then we have several portraits of what we're calling a section of men in black. Of course, black was also chic back then, as it continues to be. And these men, although wearing black, it's the most sumptuous black. And actually, Vincent van Gogh praised Frans Hals, saying that he must have had 27 shades of black. He must have had 27 blacks. Frans Hals must have had 27 blacks, is the exact quote from Vincent van Gogh. And you can see that he's manipulating these black garments to really give us a sense of the texture, particularly in the case of Tilleman Rosterman. You really feel like you can feel the velvet of this wonderful costume. He was a textile merchant, and although he's wearing black, it's the most wonderful black costume. You can see the evolution of the fashions, the lower flat collar, the doublets get a bit longer. They have these wonderful cloaks. You can see the hair is getting a bit longer, as I mentioned. And there has been suggestion that perhaps Tilleman Rosterman was actually the same figure as our Laughing Cavalier. And this is an ongoing debate. I'm not sure that's the case, but there has been this suggestion from a Frans Hals scholar in the past, and the paintings are painted 10 years apart. Another wonderful portrait from Edinburgh, and he also would have had a pendant wife. I'm just going to quickly go through to the Bachelors. These two men are really wonderful because by coincidence, they happen to both be painted in 1645, and they are both 22 years old when Frans Hals painted them. We have William Koymans on the left and Jasper Schade on the right, both incredibly wealthy. They were probably the most eligible bachelors in the Dutch Republic at mid-century. The most extravagant, flamboyant, most wonderful clothes that they're wearing. You can see that the hair has gotten longer, and it was this year that there was this dispute of the locks, as it became known, where the men of the church started to complain that men are letting their hair grow long, and some actually took scissors to their locks, but it clearly didn't affect these two individuals. And you can see Frans Hals recycling this pose with the arm on the back of the chair, much flatter collars, the most wonderful portrait from Washington. And he was from a banking family, the Koymans family, and Frans Hals actually paints a number of members of his family. He remained a bachelor for the rest of his life. And Jasper Schade was from a patrician family in Utrecht. He was an aristocrat. He does marry, and there is actually a portrait of him married where he's wearing much more sober clothes. He was really interested in fashion, and we have accounts of him spending ludicrous amounts of money on clothes in Paris. And then the last portrait in the exhibition is from the Fitzwilliam of this unknown man, painted in the 1660s when Frans Hals was in his 80s. And you really see the difference between that early Barbara portrait that we looked at and this latest portrait from the 1660s. Broad brush, unblended brush strokes. We really feel the handling of the paint in this wonderful cloak that the man is wearing. He is wearing this big, wide-brimmed hat, which there was a mania for wide hats in the 1660s, to the extent that a later owner of the painting disliked it, to the extent that he had it painted out. And when the portrait was cleaned in the Fitzwilliam Museum in the mid of the 20th century, they discovered that actually there was a hat underneath, and they restored the hat. Just goes to show you the history of these paintings and how they are transformed, but really a very different Frans Hals from the one that we started with. So I really hope that the exhibition gives our visitors a sense of, the variety of techniques that Frans Hals employs throughout his career. And although his technique does not have a linear development, we can see a progression towards, more loose handling in the later years. As Angela mentioned, we've been very, very pleased with the wonderful reviews that the exhibition has received. There's more. If you want to know more, there is a whole Meet the Expert section on our website. And this month, the Meet the Expert section is focusing on Frans Hals and the exhibition. So you can visit us at Wallace Collection Meet the Expert if you want to know more. There's a little video about the Laughing Cavalier specifically, and some short essays. Of course, we have our shop offer with these wonderful, you can leave the exhibition with a souvenir of the Laughing Cavalier. And I was delighted to see him not only as a mural, but also on the tube recently. So I think that's it. Thank you very much for listening. And I'll be happy to take some questions. Thank you very much.